Sarah Johnson, a 38-year-old black woman, had always been the pillar of strength for her family. Widowed for 5 years after losing her husband in a car accident, she had to raise her 2 children, Jamal and Aisha, all by herself. They lived in a modest yet cozy 2-bedroom home in a small town in Pennsylvania. The town was predominantly white, and while Sarah never faced blatant racism, she often felt the weight of being one of the few black families in the area. Despite the struggles, she had built a good life for her kids, working as a nurse in the local hospital, ensuring that Jamal, now 14, and Aisha, 10, were raised with love and discipline. Her world revolved around them. But Sarah, as much as she loved her children, had felt the loneliness creeping in over the years. She missed having a partner, someone to share the burdens of life with, someone who could bring balance and joy into their home. So, when she met Mark Anderson, a white man in his early 40s, it felt like a second chance at happiness. Mark had a charming demeanor, tall, with a friendly smile and soft-spoken manners that made Sarah feel at ease. He worked as a manager at a local hardware store and had recently moved to the area from a neighboring town. From their first date, Mark seemed genuinely interested in her life and, more importantly, in her children. Sarah was cautious, though. She had to be, considering the challenges of being a single mother and navigating the complexities of a new relationship. After months of dating, Sarah finally introduced Mark to Jamal and Aisha. The meeting was cordial, though Jamal seemed reserved, which Sarah attributed to typical teenage reluctance. Aisha, always the more outgoing of the two, was polite but stayed close to her mother's side. Sarah noticed the children weren't immediately drawn to Mark, but she convinced herself it was just a matter of time. "Kids, this is Mark," Sarah had said, with a hopeful smile, during their first dinner together. Mark greeted them with a warm, "Hey, you too. Your mom's told me a lot about you. I hope we can get to know each other better." His tone was friendly, but there was something in his eyes that made Jamal uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite place why. Jamal, ever observant, caught a slight twitch in Mark's smile, as if it were more forced than genuine. Despite this initial unease, Sarah grew more comfortable with Mark. Over the following months, he became a regular presence in their lives, coming over for dinner, helping with household chores, and occasionally taking the family out for small trips to the nearby parks. He even bought gifts for the children, though Jamal's remained unopened on his shelf, as the teenager couldn't shake his mistrust. Eventually, Sarah and Mark's relationship deepened, and he proposed to her after a year. "I want to build a life with you, Sarah. You and the kids mean everything to me now," he said, slipping the ring onto her finger. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She believed that Mark could fill the void her late husband had left. She imagined a future where Jamal and Aisha had a father figure again, someone to guide them, protect them, and love them as their own. But while Sarah's heart was filled with hope, there were cracks forming beneath the surface, ones she couldn't yet see. Mark wasn't as perfect as he seemed. His interactions with the children, when Sarah wasn't around, lacked warmth, and slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in a way that Sarah, in her hope for happiness, failed to notice. After the wedding, Sarah was optimistic about the new chapter in their lives. She believed that with time, Mark and the kids would develop a closer bond. However, not long after moving in, subtle changes began to take place. Small things at first, but enough to unsettle Jamal and Aisha. Mark's warm and charming demeanor seemed to dissipate when Sarah wasn't around, replaced by a coldness that made the children uneasy. Jamal, with his sharp instincts, was the first to notice the shift. Mark's friendly smiles toward him became infrequent, and soon, they were replaced by dismissive looks or impatient sighs. One evening, when Sarah was working a late shift at the hospital, Mark had made dinner for the kids. It was a simple meal, spaghetti and sauce. But as they sat down at the table, the tension was palpable. "Can you pass the salt, please?" Jamal asked, his voice tentative. Mark didn't look up from his plate. Instead, he pushed the salt shaker across the table without a word, the sound of the glass scraping against the wood echoing in the silence. Aisha, sensing the tension, kept her head down, twirling the spaghetti on her fork. Jamal, tired of pretending everything was fine, decided to confront him, in his own way. "Do you not like us?" he asked, his eyes meeting Mark's cold stare. "I mean, it feels like You don't want us here. Mark's fork paused midair, and he slowly set it down. For a moment, the kitchen felt suffocating with the weight of the unspoken tension. What kind of question is that? Mark finally said, his voice calm but laced with irritation. I married your mother, didn't I? That means I accepted you too. But it doesn't feel like it, Jamal pushed, his courage surprising even himself. Mark's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jamal saw something darker beneath his surface, a simmering resentment. Look, Mark said, leaning forward slightly, I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here for your mother. You'd do well to remember that. His voice was low, almost a growl, and Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the venom behind them. From that point on, things only grew worse. Mark never outright yelled at the children, nor was he physically aggressive, but his actions spoke volumes. He would forget to set a place for them at the dinner table or leave them behind when running errands, claiming it was too much trouble to take them. When Sarah was home, he played the role of a doting husband, always attentive and sweet, masking the growing contempt he had for her children. Aisha, though younger, wasn't oblivious to the changes. She often stayed in her room, her once bubbly personality dimming in Mark's presence. She confided in Jamal late one night when they were supposed to be asleep. I don't think Mark likes us, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jamal, sitting on the edge of his bed, clenched his fists in frustration. He doesn't, Jamal replied quietly, but we can't tell Mom yet. She won't believe it. Not until she sees it herself. But Sarah, blinded by her desire to believe in this new love, remained oblivious to the growing tension. Mark's behavior was subtle enough to keep her in the dark, and when she did catch glimpses of his coldness, she brushed it off as the usual challenges of blending a family. He's just adjusting, she'd tell herself. It'll get better with time. Yet, Mark's racism, something Sarah couldn't even fathom at first, began to show in more insidious ways. He would make offhand comments, always when Sarah wasn't around. Once, when watching the news with Jamal, a story about a protest against police brutality came on. Jamal, remembering the lessons his father had taught him about standing up for what's right, voiced his support for the protesters. Mark, without taking his eyes off the TV, muttered under his breath, maybe if they behaved better, they wouldn't be in that situation. Jamal's heart raced. He wanted to argue, but something told him it would only make things worse. Mark's words weren't just an opinion. They were a reflection of something deeper, something ugly. It became increasingly clear to Jamal and Aisha that Mark wasn't just indifferent. He harbored a quiet but growing disdain for them. And as the days passed, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse. Much worse. As the months passed, Mark's bitterness towards Jamal and Aisha became more palpable. What had started as subtle indifference now morphed into outright resentment. Mark grew increasingly jealous of the attention Sarah gave to her children. To Sarah, Jamal and Aisha were her world. She had been their sole provider, protector, and guide for years, and that bond was unbreakable. Mark, however, saw it differently. He began to view the children not as part of the family he had married into, but as obstacles, barriers between him and the complete affection he sought from Sarah. On more than one occasion, Mark would catch Sarah sitting with Jamal on the couch, helping him with his schoolwork, or giving Aisha a warm embrace before bedtime. He would watch, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. When Sarah noticed his presence, he would quickly force a smile, but the facade was beginning to slip. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Mark voiced his frustrations. You're always with them, he said, his tone sharper than usual as Sarah washed the dishes. She turned to him, confused. What do you mean? Sarah asked, wiping her hands on a towel. They're my kids, Mark. Of course I spend time with them. Mark sighed, pacing the small kitchen. I know that, but sometimes it feels like they're all you care about. Like I'm just here, watching from the sidelines. Sarah frowned, setting down the dish. That's not true, and you know it. We're a family now, Mark. You're part of this. But Mark shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. Am I? Because it doesn't feel like it. Every time I try to get close to you, they're always there, needing something. And you drop everything for them? Sarah was taken aback. She hadn't realized how much this was weighing on him, but something in his voice unsettled her. They're my children, Mark, she said, her voice softer now. They've been through so much already. You knew this when we got married. Mark's face tightened. Yeah, I did. But I didn't realize I'd always be coming second. Sarah, exasperated, tried to explain. It's not about coming second. It's about being there for each other. For all of us. But Mark wasn't listening. His jealousy had already twisted his perception. In his mind, Jamal and Aisha weren't just children. They were competitors for Sarah's love. And the more time passed, the more that feeling festered. What began as irritation slowly grew into something more dangerous, hatred. Mark's disdain for Jamal was especially intense. The boy was intelligent, observant, and fiercely protective of his mother and sister. Jamal's presence seemed to irritate Mark the most. Whenever the boy entered a room, Mark would leave shortly after. He rarely spoke to Jamal, and when he did, it was with barely concealed disdain. Once, when Sarah had gone to work early, leaving the kids at home with Mark, he couldn't hold back his contempt any longer. You think you're so smart, don't you? Mark sneered as Jamal sat at the kitchen table, working on a school project. Jamal looked up, startled by the sudden hostility in Mark's voice. What? He asked, his brow furrowing. Mark stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Always got something to say, always watching me like I'm some kind of stranger in my own house. Jamal didn't respond right away. He knew better than to engage. But something in him snapped that day. Maybe it's because you act like one, he muttered under his breath, not intending for Mark to hear. But Mark did hear, and it set off something dark within him. He slammed his hand down on the table, making Aisha jump from the living room where she had been watching TV. You little, Mark started, but he stopped himself, breathing heavily, his fists trembling. He didn't finish the sentence, but the rage in his eyes was enough to freeze Jamal in place. Go to your room, Mark hissed, his voice barely controlled. Jamal, not wanting to push things further, stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He gave Mark one last look, one filled with defiance and a hint of fear, before retreating to his room, where Aisha soon followed, her eyes wide with confusion. What happened? Aisha whispered as they sat on Jamal's bed. Why is he so mad? Jamal shook his head. I don't know, Aisha, but something's wrong with him. He hates us. I know it. Aisha's eyes filled with tears. Why? What did we do? Jamal didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew this wasn't about what they had done. This was about who they were, and that terrified him. As the days passed, Mark's behavior grew more erratic. He became short-tempered with Sarah, snapping at her over small things, especially when it involved the kids. And Sarah, though deeply in love with Mark, couldn't ignore the growing distance between him and her children. She tried to talk to him, to understand what was happening, but Mark always dismissed her concerns, blaming it on the stress of adjusting to their new life together. I'm trying, Sarah, he would say with a sigh, feigning exhaustion. It's just hard sometimes. But the truth was that Mark wasn't trying at all. His hatred for Jamal and Aisha had reached a point where he could barely stand to be in the same room with them. And every time he saw Sarah comforting them, laughing with them, or simply being the mother they needed, that hatred burned hotter. It was no longer just jealousy. It was a deep-seated rage, one that he was slowly losing control over. Mark's resentment had evolved into something darker, something dangerous. His jealousy had consumed him entirely, and it was no longer just about Sarah's attention. He had convinced himself that the only way to regain control of his life, to secure his place in Sarah's heart without the constant interference of her children, was to eliminate Jamal and Aisha. What started as frustration had festered into a malicious, twisted logic that he began to nurture. One night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside him, Mark lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't understand how things had come to this point. In his mind, he had been the perfect husband, providing for Sarah and giving her everything she could want. But she didn't see it that way. Instead, all her energy, all her love, still went to those two kids. Mark had come to see Jamal and Aisha as the source of his unhappiness, as the reason Sarah couldn't fully be his. It wasn't until a particularly bad argument between him and Sarah one evening that his thoughts took a more sinister turn. Sarah, stressed from work, had come home to find Mark complaining yet again about how much time she spent with the kids. "I just don't get it, Sarah," he had said, his voice strained with frustration. "I thought we were supposed to be building a life together. But it feels like there's always a wall between us, and that wall is them." Sarah, exhausted, finally snapped. "They're my children, Mark. What do you expect me to do? Just push them aside? I can't believe you're even talking like this." Mark's face had flushed with anger, but instead of escalating the fight, he had gone silent. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It was the kind that brewed storms. In that silence, Mark had made a decision. If Jamal and Aisha were the problem, then removing them was the solution. The thought alone had shocked him at first, but as it lingered, it began to feel more and more like a plan, like an inevitability. He rationalized it, convincing himself that without the children, he and Sarah could finally be happy. They could start over, and Sarah would thank him in the end. It was a twisted thought, but Mark had spiraled so far into his delusions that it felt logical to him. The plan began to take shape in his mind, becoming clearer with each passing day. He would wait until the right moment, when Sarah was at work and the kids were alone with him. He knew the layout of the house well, and he knew how to use the gas stove to his advantage. The idea was horrifyingly simple. He would lock Jamal and Aisha in the house, leave the gas on, and walk away. He imagined it as a quiet, quick solution, an accident that no one could question. Sarah would grieve, yes, but in time, she would move on, and they would build their life together as planned. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He meticulously planned out the details, rehearsing them in his mind over and over. He knew when Sarah would be working late, when the kids would be home from school, and how to ensure no one would suspect foul play. The day finally came. Sarah was working a double shift at the hospital, something that had become more common as the holiday season approached. Mark had taken the day off from work, claiming he wasn't feeling well. When Jamal and Aisha came home from school that afternoon, they noticed Mark's unusual quietness, but neither of them questioned it. They had become used to his mood swings and cold demeanor. Jamal, ever cautious, kept his distance, while Aisha busied herself with her homework at the kitchen table. Mark watched them from the living room, his heart pounding. He knew what he was about to do was irreversible, but he had convinced himself that this was the only way. "You guys hungry?" he asked suddenly, standing up. His voice was oddly calm, which made Jamal glance up in suspicion. "Not really," Jamal replied, wary of any sudden kindness from Mark. Aisha, too focused on her schoolwork, simply shook her head. Mark shrugged. "Well, I'm going to make something anyway. Your mom will be home late, so we'll have dinner ready for her." Jamal's stomach tightened. Something about the way Mark was acting didn't sit right. He glanced at Aisha, who was oblivious to the tension, and decided to keep an eye on their stepfather. Mark moved around the kitchen, setting the stage for his deadly plan. He opened the windows slightly, just enough to prevent the smell of gas from being noticeable from outside, but not enough to air out the house. His heart raced as he twisted the gas knob on the stove, but instead of lighting the burner, he left the gas leaking into the air. Then, he turned to Jamal and Aisha, masking his panic with a forced smile. "I'm just going to step out for a bit. Make sure you stay inside. Okay? Don't open the doors to anyone." Jamal frowned. "Where are you going?" "Just running a quick errand," Mark said, already moving toward the door. "I'll be back soon." Something in Jamal's gut told him this wasn't right. As soon as Mark closed the door behind him, locking it from the outside, Jamal jumped up. The strange, faint smell in the air. He recognized it. "Gas." "Aisha," he said urgently, grabbing his sister's arm. "We need to get out. Now." Jamal's heart raced as the realization hit him. The smell of gas was unmistakable now. He knew they were in immediate danger. He glanced at Aisha, who was still seated at the kitchen table, unaware of the severity of the situation. Fear and urgency surged through him. "Aisha, get up!" Jamal shouted, startling his younger sister. "What's going on?" she asked, confused by his sudden panic. "There's gas, Aisha. Mark. He locked us in here, and he turned the gas on." Jamal's voice was tight with fear, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that panicking wouldn't help. He had to protect Aisha, no matter what. Aisha's eyes widened in fear as she began to process what her brother was saying. "But why would he do that?" she stammered, tears already forming in her eyes. Jamal didn't have time to explain. He ran to the front door and tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Mark had locked it from the outside, just as he had planned. Jamal ran to the back door, hoping for a different outcome, but it too was locked tight. The windows, though slightly ajar, were too high for them to climb through. "We're trapped," Jamal muttered, his mind racing. He knew they didn't have much time. The smell of gas was getting stronger, and with each breath, he felt the panic rising. He had to think of a way out, fast. Aisha clung to him, her small frame shaking with fear. "What are we going to do, Jamal?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," Jamal said, though his own heart was pounding in his chest. "We're going to figure this out." He quickly ran to the kitchen and turned off the gas knobs on the stove, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. The gas had already filled the air, and they needed to get out before it was too late. His eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could help them escape. The windows. They were the only chance. Jamal grabbed a chair and dragged it to the window over the kitchen sink. He climbed up and tried to force the window open wider, but it wouldn't budge beyond the small gap Mark had left. His hands shook as he pushed with all his strength, but it was no use. "Aisha, help me," he called, his voice strained. Aisha ran over, her fear momentarily forgotten as she joined him, pushing with all her might. Together, they managed to open the window a little more, but it still wasn't enough for either of them to crawl through. "We're not going to fit," Aisha said, tears streaming down her face. Jamal's mind raced. He refused to give up. Not like this. He jumped down from the chair and ran to the hallway closet, pulling out the small toolbox his mother kept there. He grabbed a hammer and ran back to the window, determination burning in his eyes. "Stand back," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the terror swirling inside him. Aisha stepped aside as Jamal swung the hammer at the glass with all his strength. The window shattered with a loud crash, sending shards of glass scattering across the counter and floor. The fresh air that rushed in was a small relief, but they still needed to get out. Jamal quickly cleared away the remaining glass from the window frame, trying to make it as safe as possible for Aisha to crawl through. "Come on, Aisha. You go first," he said, lifting her up toward the window. Aisha hesitated, her wide eyes locked on her brother's. "What about you? I'll be right behind you. Just go," Jamal urged, his voice filled with both fear and urgency. Aisha nodded and, with Jamal's help, squeezed through the narrow opening. She landed outside on the grass, breathing heavily, her small frame shaking with fear. Jamal climbed up next, his heart pounding as he squeezed himself through the broken window. Just as he started to pull himself out, his foot slipped, and he fell hard onto the kitchen floor, knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, everything went blurry, but he forced himself to get up, gasping for air. The smell of gas was overwhelming now. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. His lungs burned as he scrambled to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He hoisted himself up to the window again, ignoring the shards of glass still sticking out from the frame, and pulled himself through. He hit the ground next to Aisha, his entire body trembling. For a moment, they just lay there in the grass, both of them gasping for breath. Jamal felt dizzy from the gas, his vision swimming. But they were outside. They were alive. "We have to go," Jamal said, struggling to his feet. He pulled Aisha up, and they stumbled away from the house, putting as much distance between themselves and the deadly trap as they could. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Aisha clung to him, sobbing quietly. "Why would he do this, Jamal? Why?" Jamal didn't have an answer. His mind was still reeling from the near-death experience, and all he could think about was how close they had come to dying. He pulled Aisha close, holding her tightly. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice cracking, "but we're going to tell Mom everything. She has to know. She has to stop him. As they stumbled down the street, Jamal's mind flashed back to every cold look, every dismissive word, every uneasy feeling he'd had about Mark. He had known something was wrong, but he never imagined it would come to this. They had narrowly escaped death, but Jamal knew this wasn't over. Mark wasn't going to stop, and they couldn't go back to that house. Not while he was still free. The moment Jamal smashed the window and pulled Aisha to safety, the reality of their situation hit him like a freight train. The cool air outside was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had filled the house, and yet the danger was far from over. His heart pounded relentlessly in his chest as he tried to gather his thoughts. Aisha, trembling beside him, was clutching his arm, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Jamal, why would he do this? Aisha's voice cracked as she stared up at her older brother. Her innocence, her inability to fully grasp the evil behind Mark's actions, broke Jamal's heart. I don't know, he replied, though deep down, he had his suspicions. Mark had never accepted them. From the very beginning, there had been something off. Something cold and calculating behind the man's forced smiles and distant demeanor. Jamal had tried to tell himself it was just adjustment, just the awkwardness of a new family dynamic, but he knew better now. Mark wasn't just cold, he was dangerous, and they had barely escaped his trap. We need to get help, Jamal said, his voice urgent as he scanned the neighborhood. It was quiet, the street lined with houses that seemed so far removed from the horror they had just experienced. He grabbed Aisha's hand. We have to find someone. Mom needs to know what happened. Aisha nodded, her small frame shaking. But where can we go? What if Mark comes back? Jamal's eyes darted around. They couldn't stay near the house, that much was clear. But running aimlessly down the street wasn't an option either. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Then it hit him. Mrs. Jenkins? She was an older woman who lived a few houses down from them. She had always been kind, offering them cookies on hot summer days and chatting with Sarah whenever they passed by. Jamal remembered her mentioning once that if they ever needed anything, her door was always open. Mrs. Jenkins, he said, pulling Aisha in the direction of the elderly woman's house. She'll help us. The two of them ran, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the evening. Every shadow seemed threatening, and Jamal couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting Mark to be right behind them. When they reached Mrs. Jenkins' front porch, Jamal pounded on the door with all his might, praying that she was home. A moment later, the porch light flickered on, and Mrs. Jenkins opened the door. Her face, creased with age, softened immediately when she saw the children. Jamal? Aisha? What's going on? She asked, her voice laced with concern as she ushered them inside. Are you two all right? You look terrified. Mrs. Jenkins, we need help, Jamal blurted out, his voice shaking. It's Mark. He locked us in the house and turned on the gas. He tried to kill us. Mrs. Jenkins' hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. What? Oh my dear Lord. She quickly guided them to the living room, her hands trembling as she grabbed her phone. Sit down, both of you. I'm calling your mother right now. Jamal and Aisha sat on the worn, floral-patterned couch, their bodies tense with lingering fear. Aisha curled up against Jamal, her small frame trembling uncontrollably. Jamal wrapped an arm around her, trying to offer some semblance of comfort, though his own heart was pounding in his chest. He could still smell the gas, still feel the danger hanging in the air. Mrs. Jenkins dialed Sarah's number, her fingers shaking as she pressed the buttons. Come on, Sarah. Pick up, she muttered under her breath. After a few rings, Sarah answered. Hello? Sarah's voice was tired, but concerned, as though sensing something was wrong. Sarah, it's Beatrice Jenkins, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice tight with urgency. You need to come home right now. It's about the kids. Jamal could hear the panic rising in his mother's voice on the other end of the line. What happened? Are they okay? What's going on? They're safe here with me, but... Sarah, it's Mark, Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice trembling. The children say he tried to harm them. He turned on the gas in your house and locked them inside. There was a long pause on the line, and Jamal could only imagine the shock and fear flooding his mother at that moment. "I'm coming right now," Sarah finally said, her voice frantic. "Please keep them safe. I'll be there as soon as I can." Mrs. Jenkins hung up the phone and turned to the children, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Your mom is on her way," she said gently. "Everything's going to be all right." But Jamal wasn't so sure. The relief he felt at escaping the house was fleeting. What if Mark came looking for them? What if he wasn't finished? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. "We can't go back," Jamal said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Not while he's there." Mrs. Jenkins looked at him with understanding. "Don't worry, dear. I'll make sure you're safe. He won't be able to hurt you again." As they waited for their mother to arrive, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Jamal's mind kept replaying the events. The sound of the gas hissing from the stove, the feel of the door locked tight behind them, the sheer terror of realizing that Mark, the man who had married their mother, had tried to kill them. He looked at Aisha, her face pale and streaked with tears, and his heart ached. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. Minutes later, they heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the house. The door burst open, and there stood Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and worry. "Jamal, Aisha," she cried, rushing toward them. Jamal stood, his body stiff with shock, as his mother pulled him and Aisha into a tight embrace. He could feel her trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What happened? How could this happen?" Jamal pulled back slightly, meeting his mother's tear-filled eyes. "Mom, it was Mark," he said, his voice hoarse. "He tried to kill us." The moment Sarah held her children in her arms, she felt the world spinning beneath her. How could this have happened? How could the man she had trusted, the man she had married, have done something so horrifying? She pulled Jamal and Aisha closer, tears streaming down her face as her mind raced, trying to comprehend the reality they were now living. Jamal, still in shock but determined to stay strong for his sister, looked up at his mother. "Mom, he locked us in the house," he began, his voice shaking. He turned on the gas. "We almost didn't make it out." Sarah's heart broke at the terror in his voice. She knelt down to look him in the eyes, brushing a tear from his cheek. "You're safe now. I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't there," she whispered, guilt flooding her. But this wasn't her fault. It was Mark, the man she had let into their lives. Mrs. Jenkins, standing nearby, cleared her throat gently. "Sarah, you need to call the police. He can't get away with this. That man. He's dangerous." Sarah's hands trembled as she nodded, pulling out her phone. She dialed 911, her voice barely steady as she reported what had happened. "Please, send someone quickly," she said, her voice urgent. "My husband. He tried to harm my children. He locked them in our house with the gas on." As she hung up, Sarah's mind swirled with a mix of emotions: rage, fear, disbelief. How had she missed the signs? How had she not seen what Mark was capable of? She had been so desperate for love, so hopeful that Mark could be the father figure her children needed. Now, that hope was shattered, and the only thing left was her fierce determination to protect her kids. She looked down at Jamal and Aisha again. "We're leaving that house," she said firmly. "I don't care what it takes. We're not going back there. Not while he's out there." Jamal nodded, his expression tense. "We can't, Mom. He's dangerous." Sarah wrapped her arms around both of her children, pulling them close. "I promise you, he's never going to hurt you again. Never." Minutes later, the sound of police sirens filled the quiet neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed outside as the police arrived at Mrs. Jenkins' house. Sarah stood, feeling a mix of relief and dread. She knew this was far from over, but at least now, the law was involved. An officer knocked on the door, and Mrs. Jenkins opened it quickly. The officer, a middle-aged man with a calm but serious expression, stepped inside. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Daniels. We got a report of a domestic incident. Can you tell us what happened?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with anger as she explained the events of the evening. My husband, Mark Anderson, locked my children in our house and turned on the gas. He was trying to kill them. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow, his face hardening. Where is he now? I don't know, Sarah replied, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. He left after he locked them in. I came here as soon as I found out. Daniels nodded and gestured to his partner. We'll send a unit to your house immediately. We need to find him before he can do anything else. As the officers spoke quietly among themselves, Sarah's mind raced. She realized that Mark's plan wasn't just about harming her children. It was about taking away everything she loved. She had married a monster, and now that monster was out there, possibly plotting his next move. Officer, Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling with urgency. You don't understand. He's capable of anything. You have to find him. He won't stop. Daniels looked at her with understanding in his eyes. We'll find him, ma'am. I promise. Just then, Jamal, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up. He hates us, Mom. He's always hated us. I knew it, but I didn't think he'd actually try to. His voice cracked, and he looked down at the floor, ashamed that he hadn't warned his mother sooner. Sarah knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. Jamal, this is not your fault. You couldn't have known he'd do something like this. I should have seen it. But now, we're going to make sure he never gets close to us again. Do you hear me? Jamal nodded, though the guilt still weighed heavy on his heart. Aisha, her eyes filled with tears, finally spoke in a small voice. Why does he hate us so much, Mom? Sarah's heart ached at her daughter's question. How could she explain the unexplainable? The truth was ugly, and it was something she had never wanted her children to experience. But now, there was no avoiding it. Some people, they carry hate in their hearts for reasons that don't make any sense, Sarah said softly, holding Aisha close. Mark, he's one of those people. But that hate is his problem, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong, Aisha. Do you hear me? This is not your fault. Aisha nodded, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. As the police left to search for Mark, Officer Daniels handed Sarah his card. We'll keep a close watch on your house. If you hear anything from him or see anything suspicious, you call us immediately. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she took the card. Thank you, officer. After the police left, Mrs. Jenkins offered to let them stay the night. You're not going back to that house tonight, she said firmly, her kind eyes full of concern. You and the kids can stay here as long as you need. Sarah gave her a grateful smile. Thank you, Beatrice. I don't know what we would have done without you. Jamal and Aisha, exhausted from the night's events, were already curled up on the couch. Sarah sat down beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them. They were safe for now, but the fear of what could happen next still lingered. She had no idea where Mark was or what he was planning, but one thing was clear. She would do whatever it took to keep her children safe. As she sat there, holding her kids close, Sarah's mind was already working on a plan. Mark may have thought he could break them, but he was wrong. She wasn't just fighting for her children's safety now. She was fighting for their future and for their right to live without fear. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through Mrs. Jenkins' living room window, casting a soft glow over the small space where Jamal and Aisha slept on the couch. Sarah had barely slept, her mind plagued by the events of the previous night. She couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come to losing her children, and how the man she had trusted, the man she had welcomed into her life, had been the one to orchestrate it. Her hands trembled as she sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. Mrs. Jenkins quietly joined her, offering a comforting smile. They're strong, Sarah. They've been through something unimaginable, but they've got you, and that's what matters. Sarah nodded, though her heart was still heavy. I don't understand how I didn't see it sooner, she said, her voice thick with emotion. How could I have let this happen? You can't blame yourself, Mrs. Jenkins replied gently. You wanted love, Sarah. You wanted happiness for your children. There's nothing wrong with that. Before Sarah could respond, Jamal stirred on the couch, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, momentarily disoriented, before the memories of the night came rushing back. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Aisha, who was still sleeping soundly beside him. Jamal stood and walked over to the kitchen, his face tense. Sarah stood up, meeting her son with open arms. She hugged him tightly, her heart aching for the pain he must have felt. "I'm so sorry, Jamal," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen what he was doing to you. To both of you." Jamal pulled back slightly, looking up at his mother with serious eyes. "Mom, we tried to tell you, but we knew you wouldn't believe it, not until something really bad happened." His voice was soft, but the pain in his words was undeniable. Sarah's heart sank. She knew he was right. She had been so blinded by her desire to create a new life, to give her children a father figure, that she had ignored the warning signs. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I didn't want to believe it, Jamal. I'm so sorry." Jamal, seeing the guilt in his mother's face, shook his head. "It's not your fault, Mom. None of us knew how far he would go. But I saw it. The way he looked at us, the way he treated us when you weren't around." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her son's words. "What do you mean?" Jamal hesitated, glancing at the floor. "He wasn't just cold, Mom. He hated us. From the beginning, I could tell he didn't want us there. He'd say things, small comments that didn't seem like much, but I knew what he meant. The way he talked about people on TV, the way he looked at me, at Aisha, it was like he blamed us for everything." Sarah's heart twisted with anger and regret. She had seen glimpses of this, but she had brushed them aside, convincing herself that Mark was just adjusting to being part of a new family. Now, she saw how deeply she had misunderstood the situation. Jamal continued, his voice growing more intense. "There was this one time, when you were at work late, he told me, I didn't marry your mother to play babysitter to a couple of brats." Jamal paused, his jaw tightening. "He said we were in the way, that you would never love him the way he wanted with us around." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea that Mark had been speaking to her children like this, that he had been poisoning their home with his hatred behind her back. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jamal shook his head. "I didn't think you'd believe me. You were so happy with him, and I didn't want to ruin that. I didn't want you to think I was just trying to push him away." Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I would have believed you, Jamal. I should have listened. I'm so sorry I didn't." Jamal looked away, his expression conflicted. "It's okay, Mom. But now you know. He wasn't just some jealous guy. He was dangerous. He wanted us gone." At that moment, Aisha stirred on the couch, slowly waking up. She rubbed her eyes and looked around, her face still marked with the remnants of fear from the night before. She got up and walked over to her mother and brother, her voice small and fragile. "Mom, is Mark gone?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sadness. Sarah knelt down to Aisha's level, pulling her into a tight hug. "Yes, baby, he's gone, and he's never coming back." Aisha rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her little body shaking with relief. "Why did he hate us?" she whispered. Sarah's heart broke all over again. How could she explain such evil to a child? How could she make sense of the senseless? She stroked Aisha's hair gently. "It wasn't about you, sweetheart. It was about him. He had hate in his heart, and that's something we'll never understand. But you're safe now. I promise you you're safe." As Sarah held her children close, a fierce resolve built within her. She had failed to see the truth before, but now that she knew, she would never let Mark, or anyone like him, get near her family again. She would protect them, fight for them, and make sure they knew that no one, no matter how charming or kind they seemed, would ever come before them again. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but when Mrs. Jenkins opened the door, it was Officer Daniels from the night before. "We found him," he said, his voice grim. "Mark was picked up trying to leave town early this morning. He's in custody now, and we'll be charging him with attempted murder." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with anger. "Thank you, officer," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to make sure he never gets out. He tried to kill my children. He can't ever hurt us again." Officer Daniels nodded, his face serious. We'll make sure he pays for what he did, ma'am. You have my word." As the officer left, Sarah sat back down with Jamal and Aisha, holding them close. They had been through something no child should ever have to endure, but they had survived. And now, they would begin to heal, together. The weeks that followed felt surreal for Sarah and her children. The arrest of Mark Anderson had shaken their entire community, but the support Sarah received from her neighbors, colleagues, and friends helped carry them through the initial shock. However, the weight of the looming trial was a constant presence, hanging over their heads like a storm cloud. Mark was in custody, but the full story still needed to be told in court, and Sarah knew she and her children would have to relive the horror of that night to ensure justice was served. Sarah spent her days trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Jamal and Aisha, but their lives had irrevocably changed. Aisha, once bright and carefree, had become more withdrawn, often seeking comfort in her mother's arms. Jamal, on the other hand, had become more protective of his sister, often standing guard as if expecting danger at every turn. Sarah saw the toll the trauma had taken on them and felt a surge of anger every time she thought of Mark. As the trial date approached, Sarah's emotions became a mixture of dread and determination. She knew that Mark would be facing charges of attempted murder and hate crimes, and while the legal system was now on their side, there was a nagging fear that justice might not be enough to undo the damage he had caused. On the day of the trial, Sarah and her children entered the courthouse, accompanied by their lawyer and a few close friends. The large, imposing building felt cold and intimidating, but Sarah stood tall, holding Aisha's hand tightly as Jamal walked on her other side. She was their strength now, and she wouldn't let them see her fear. Inside the courtroom, they faced Mark for the first time since that terrible night. He sat at the defense table, his once charming face now expressionless, cold. Sarah couldn't believe she had ever trusted him. The man she saw before her was a stranger, a monster she had unknowingly allowed into their lives. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor laid out the case against Mark, recounting the events of that night in chilling detail. Sarah felt her stomach churn as she listened, but she kept her focus on her children, knowing they needed her strength now more than ever. Then came the moment when Jamal was called to testify. Sarah's heart ached as she watched her son walk to the witness stand. He was so young, yet he had been forced to grow up too quickly. Jamal took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Mark. The man who had once been in their home, sitting at their dinner table, now looked at him with a blank, almost detached expression. The prosecutor asked Jamal to recount what had happened, and with a steady voice, Jamal told the court everything. He spoke about the gas, the locked doors, and how he had saved Aisha by breaking the window and escaping. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, as he described how Mark had left them to die. "I knew he didn't want us there," Jamal said, his voice firm but laced with emotion. "He hated us, and that night, he tried to make sure we wouldn't be in his way anymore." The courtroom was silent as Jamal finished his testimony, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, not just because of the pain her son had endured, but because of the courage he had shown in standing up to the man who had tried to destroy them. Next, Aisha was called to the stand. Sarah's heart clenched as she watched her daughter climb into the witness chair, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden seat. Aisha's voice trembled as she began to speak, but she held her composure, recounting the terror she had felt when they realized what Mark had done. "He locked us in," Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "And I was so scared. I didn't think we were going to get out." Sarah could hardly bear to watch, but she knew this was necessary. Aisha needed to be heard, needed to share her truth. The defense tried to argue that Mark had never intended to hurt the children, suggesting that it had all been a misunderstanding. But the prosecutor, sharp and unyielding, dismantled that argument piece by piece. The evidence was overwhelming. The gas stove, the locked doors, Mark's attempts to flee after the incident. There was no misunderstanding. It had been a deliberate, calculated act. Finally, Sarah was called to the stand. As she sat down, she felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, but all she could see was Mark. She spoke about the months leading up to the incident, how she had missed the signs of his hatred and jealousy. She admitted her own guilt in not protecting her children sooner, but she made it clear that this wasn't just about her failure. It was about Mark's calculated cruelty. "My children's lives were in danger because of him," she said, her voice steady and strong. "He hated them because they were mine, because they were black, and he tried to take them away from me forever. He thought he could get away with it, but we're here today to make sure he doesn't." When she finished, the prosecutor thanked her and moved on, leaving Sarah to return to her seat beside her children. She squeezed Jamal and Aisha's hands, silently telling them that it would be over soon. The trial lasted several days, but when the jury finally returned with their verdict, Sarah held her breath. The judge's voice echoed through the silent room. "Guilty on all counts." The words were a relief, but they didn't bring the closure Sarah had hoped for. Mark was taken away in handcuffs, his face still expressionless, as if the verdict meant nothing to him. But to Sarah, it meant everything. Justice had been served, and Mark would spend the rest of his life in prison for what he had done. He would never be able to hurt her family again. As they left the courthouse, Sarah, Jamal, and Aisha stood outside, the weight of the trial slowly lifting off their shoulders. The sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just endured. Sarah looked down at her children, seeing the strength in their eyes. They had survived something unimaginable, and while the scars of that night would stay with them, they had come out the other side, stronger, together. Jamal turned to his mother, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "It's over, right? He's gone." Sarah nodded, pulling him and Aisha into a tight embrace. "Yes, baby, it's over, and we're going to be okay. We're going to move forward together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah believed those words. They had faced the worst, but they had survived, and now they could begin to heal. In the weeks following the trial, life slowly began to settle back into a new sense of normalcy for Sarah, Jamal, and Aisha. Though the shadows of what they had endured lingered, there was also a sense of relief that came with knowing Mark was behind bars, where he could no longer hurt them. The community rallied around the family, offering support in ways that Sarah had never anticipated. Neighbors brought over meals, the local church held a small fundraiser to help them move into a new home, and Sarah's colleagues at the hospital covered her shifts, giving her the time she needed to be with her children. They had left the house that held so many painful memories and moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was cozy and felt like a fresh start. The walls were still bare, and boxes sat unopened in the corner of the living room, but for the first time in a long while, the tension in the air had eased. This was their space now, a safe space, free from the fear that had once haunted them. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah unpacked the last of their things, she found herself pausing to look out the window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a soft glow over the apartment. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She had been through hell and back, but her children were alive, and they were here with her. That was all that mattered. Jamal, ever the protector, had thrown himself into his schoolwork, determined to stay busy and keep his mind off the trauma they had survived. But Sarah could still see the worry etched into his features, the way he would check the locks on the doors before going to bed each night. It would take time for him to fully let go of the fear, but Sarah was determined to help him heal. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in their small kitchen, she heard a quiet knock at the door. When she opened it, she found their neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Lopez, standing there with a kind smile. "I made some extra soup tonight and thought you might like some," Mrs. Lopez said, holding out a large pot. Sarah smiled gratefully. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Lopez. You didn't have to do that." The older woman waved off the thanks. "It's nothing, dear. We all need a little help sometimes, and after everything you've been through." She trailed off, her expression softening. "Well, let's just say you're not alone." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. It was these small gestures that reminded her of the kindness and support that still existed in the world, despite everything they had been through. After Mrs. Lopez left, Jamal and Aisha sat down at the table for dinner. Aisha, still quiet but slowly returning to her bubbly self, picked at her food before looking up at her brother. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" she asked softly, her wide eyes filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from experiencing hardship at a young age. Jamal, always thoughtful, paused before answering. "I think things will be different," he said carefully, "but maybe they'll be better. We're safe now." Aisha nodded, seeming to accept his answer, but Sarah could see the lingering worry in her daughter's eyes. She knew the road to healing wouldn't be easy, but she also knew they were on that path now. After dinner, as the kids went to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the journey they had taken together. She had been so desperate for love, for a sense of family after her husband's death, that she hadn't seen the danger in Mark. But now, with everything behind them, she realized that the love she had been seeking was already right there, in her children. The next morning, Sarah took Jamal and Aisha to the park. It was a beautiful day, with the sun shining brightly and a cool breeze in the air. As they walked together, Aisha skipped ahead, giggling as she chased after a butterfly. Jamal, always protective, kept a close eye on her, but Sarah noticed a small smile on his face. He was beginning to relax, to feel like a kid again. They found a quiet bench, and Sarah sat down, watching her children play. The laughter that filled the air was a welcome sound, a reminder that life, despite its hardships, could still be filled with joy. After a while, Jamal joined his mother on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "Mom?" he asked, glancing at her. "What happens now? I mean, with us?" Sarah looked at him, her heart swelling with pride at how brave and strong he had been through everything. "Now?" she repeated, smiling softly. "Now we live, Jamal. We keep going. We stay together, and we rebuild. One step at a time." Jamal nodded, seeming to find comfort in her words. "I think we'll be okay," he said after a moment. "We will be," Sarah replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've been through the worst of it, and we came out the other side. That means we're stronger than ever." Jamal smiled, a real smile, not the forced one he had worn for so many months. And in that moment, Sarah knew they were going to be all right. The past would always be a part of them, but it wouldn't define them. They were moving forward, together. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the park, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The darkness that had once clouded their lives had lifted, and in its place was hope. Hope for the future, for the life they would build together. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to truly believe in that future. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving,